Most people imagine discipline as something dramatic. They imagine a breaking point, a night of frustration, a vow spoken with enough force to split life into before and after. In that fantasy, a person wakes up the next morning transformed. The lazy become relentless. The distracted become focused. The weak become unshakable. One decision, one burst of will, one perfect beginning, and everything changes. It is an attractive story. It is also the story that keeps many people trapped. Because when real change begins quietly, they do not recognize it as change at all. When discipline arrives in a form that feels ordinary, repetitive, and almost unimpressive, they overlook it. They think it cannot possibly be enough. They mistake simplicity for weakness. They mistake smallness for irrelevance. And then they return to waiting for a dramatic future that never fully comes. Real discipline rarely announces itself. It looks like sitting down to work before you feel inspired. It looks like putting on shoes and stepping outside when your mind says, "Stay where it is comfortable." It looks like reading one page when one page feels meaningless. It looks like cleaning your desk, preparing your clothes, filling the water bottle, opening the notebook, making the first move before the emotional weather improves. These acts are so quiet that modern culture barely knows how to respect them. We are trained to admire intensity. We love the visible breakthrough, the radical reinvention, the montage of sudden success. We are shown outcomes, not maintenance. We are shown victory, not repetition. We are shown the shining blade, not the hand that sharpened it every morning. But the Viking world was built on a harsher truth. You could not wait for the perfect mood to repair a ship. You could not delay preparation until courage arrived. You could not ask the sea to return later when you felt more ready. Life demanded readiness before feeling. Imagine a Viking warrior before dawn. The fire is low, the camp is still, the air is sharp with cold. Somewhere beyond the dark edge of shore, water presses quietly against wood. Nothing heroic is happening. No one is watching. No enemy stands in front of him. And yet something decisive is taking place. He sits down with his sword and a sharpening stone. Then he begins. One slow pass of the blade, then another. Metal against stone, a steady scraping rhythm. If you looked at only one moment of that ritual, it would seem almost meaningless. The sword does not change in a dramatic flash. The edge does not glow. There is no applause for maintenance. But the warrior understands what the impatient mind refuses to learn. Readiness is built before it is needed. Each pass removes what should not remain. Each pass makes the next pass more effective. Each pass strengthens something that will matter later. That is what habits are. They are not glamorous. They are preparatory. They are the repeated shaping of future capacity. The person who writes a little every day is sharpening thought. The person who trains a little every day is sharpening endurance. The person who returns to a small promise every day is sharpening character. And this is where real discipline begins. Not in a perfect emotional state, not in a cinematic moment of self-conquest. It begins when you stop asking whether the act feels big enough to matter and start respecting repetition itself. The small act is not beneath transformation. The small act is where transformation lives. Most people want the edge. Very few people learn to love the stone. That is why the smallest disciplined action is never truly small. It is not only what you do, it is what you rehearse. It is a signal sent into the future. When the moment comes, I intend to be ready. The brain changes in a way that the impatient mind often hates. It changes through repetition more than intensity. It does not care very much about the drama of your intentions. It responds to what you do often. Every repeated action tells the nervous system, "This matters. Keep this pathway available." Over time, the pathway strengthens. The action becomes easier to access. The friction decreases. What once felt awkward begins to feel familiar. What once needed persuasion begins to happen with less argument. This is the quiet science beneath habit. At first, every useful change feels expensive. The mind protests. It negotiates. It offers delay with a calm and reasonable voice. Start tomorrow. Do it when you feel clearer. Begin when the schedule is cleaner. Wait until you can do it properly. This inner voice rarely says never. It simply says, not now. And that is why it is so dangerous. Delay sounds harmless in the moment. But repeated delay becomes identity just as surely as repeated action does. People often try to build a new life with willpower alone. They set goals that flatter the imagination. They create large routines, intense schedules, strict rules. For a short time, this can feel powerful. Energy rises. Emotion is high. The person feels serious. But then life returns. Fatigue appears. Stress enters. Sleep worsens. Motivation changes. And because the entire structure depended on a temporary emotional wave, it collapses when the wave disappears. Habits solve this problem by storing decision. A habit is a choice made once and reinforced enough times that it no longer needs to be renegotiated from the beginning each day. Instead of arguing with yourself every morning about whether to act, you inherit the pattern you have already built. That is why habits feel smaller than heroic effort, but become stronger over time. They reduce the cost of action. Small habits are especially powerful because they slip under resistance. 1 page is easier than 1 chapter. 5 minutes is easier than an hour. 1 push-up is easier than promising a new body by next month. The smaller the beginning, the less material resistance has to work with. And once the action starts, continuation becomes more possible than it was a moment before. Motion reshapes mood more reliably than mood creates motion. There is also a deeper psychological force at work: evidence. The brain does not fully trust emotional declarations. It trusts proof. If you repeatedly say, "I am disciplined," while repeatedly avoiding the thing you plan to do, some part of you stops believing your words. But when you act, even briefly, even imperfectly, you produce evidence. 1 page is evidence. A short walk is evidence. 10 minutes of focus is evidence. The mind begins revising its picture of who you are, not because you believed harder, but because you behaved differently often enough to make the old story unstable. That is how identity changes. Not by proclamation, by accumulation. You become someone who writes by writing. You become someone who trains by training. You become someone who returns by returning. Tiny actions look weak only to the part of us addicted to spectacle. In reality, tiny actions are often the most intelligent strategy available. They make consistency realistic. They let discipline survive ordinary days, messy schedules, low energy, and imperfect moods. And a discipline that only survives ideal conditions is not discipline at all. It is convenience dressed in serious language. And because habits lower the cost of right action, they protect you from the emotional volatility that ruins so many good intentions. They let steady effort outlast unstable feeling. The pattern becomes a kind of stored wisdom. It reminds you what to do before emotion has time to confuse the issue. Return to the image of the blade because it reveals something essential about human change. A dull sword and a sharp sword may look similar from a distance. The difference becomes obvious only at the moment of contact. The same is true of the mind. Two people can speak about goals in almost identical language. Both can say they want focus, strength, self-respect, mastery. But when boredom arrives, when fatigue enters, when distraction calls, when progress is still invisible, the difference appears. That is where the edge reveals itself. Most people quit in the invisible phase. This is the stretch of time in which effort has begun, but reward has not yet become obvious. It is one of the hardest stages of discipline because the ego wants proof. It wants visible movement. It wants immediate confirmation that the ritual is working. Without that confirmation, the mind begins to whisper that the act is pointless. Why keep going if the result still looks the same? Why keep sharpening if the blade still seems ordinary? Why keep writing if the pages still feel clumsy? Why keep walking if the body is not changed? Why keep practicing if your skill still embarrasses you? But the invisible phase is not empty. It is where the real shaping happens. A blade is altered by repeated contact, long before the eye fully notices. The nervous system is altered by repeated behavior, long before your life looks different from the outside. That is why discipline often feels unrewarding at first. You are working in a territory where consequence is delayed. You are investing before the return is visible. You are maintaining faith in a process that does not flatter the ego quickly enough. This is difficult. It is also unavoidable. Think of the person learning to write consistently. At first, each session feels heavy. They sit down and the mind resists. The sentences come slowly. The work feels unimpressive, but something is being trained that goes beyond the paragraph itself. Attention is being trained. Tolerance for discomfort is being trained. The transition from resistance to action is being trained. The identity of someone who sits down anyway is taking shape. Think of the person rebuilding physical discipline. At first, the workout is modest, the walk is short, the strength is limited. Nothing about it looks cinematic, but the body is being reminded of movement. The mind is being taught follow-through. The day is being reorganized around action instead of avoidance. The edge is being formed quietly. This is the sharpening effect of habits. Each repetition removes a little hesitation. Each repetition reduces the amount of friction around beginning. Each repetition makes the next repetition more likely. Until one day, something that once felt difficult begins to feel normal. That change may seem sudden when it finally becomes visible, but it was never sudden. It was layered, built through contact, built through return, built in the exact moments that previously looked too small to matter. And here is the deeper lesson. The prepared mind is not a mind without resistance. It is a mind with a trained response to resistance. The disciplined person is not someone who always feels ready. It is someone who no longer treats every feeling as a command. They have rituals. They have sequence. They know what the next action is. Because they know it, they waste less life renegotiating with themselves. That is what the sharpening ritual gives you. Not perfection. Readiness. That is why discipline often feels quiet, while it is becoming powerful. The edge is formed in advance. The ritual decides more than the moment does. One of the most destructive myths about discipline is the myth of perfection. Many people believe that a habit only counts if it is performed flawlessly, at the ideal time, with full energy, under clean and controlled conditions. If the streak is broken, they assume the identity was false. If a day is missed, they interpret the miss as evidence that nothing real was ever built. Then shame enters. And shame, more than laziness, often destroys continuity. But continuity is where strength lives. Missing one day does not erase a habit. What matters is the story you tell after the missed day. If the story becomes, "I failed, so I should wait for a more dramatic restart," then one interruption becomes a new pattern of avoidance. But if the story becomes, "I return now, even modestly," then the ritual survives. That survival matters more than almost anything. Think again of the warrior and the blade. If one morning passes without sharpening, the sword does not become useless in a single sunrise. The edge does not vanish all at once. What matters is return. Return before the mind turns one imperfect day into an excuse for abandoning the path entirely. Return while the ritual still remembers you. This is why tiny restarts are often wiser than grand restarts. Read one paragraph. Do 5 minutes. Write one honest sentence. Walk to the end of the road and back. Clean one corner of the room. Stretch for 2 minutes. These small returns feel unimpressive to the ego, but they are extremely powerful for identity. They say, the pattern still exists. I am still the kind of person who comes back. Self-trust is rebuilt not through a heroic apology to yourself, but through a modest act performed quickly enough to interrupt the downward story. The 2-minute rule is useful for this reason. It lowers the threshold of beginning. It respects a simple truth. The hardest part of discipline is often not the work itself, but crossing the line between intending and doing. Once the body is moving, once the page is open, once the first action is underway, continuation becomes more possible than it was in thought. You do not always need a larger dream. Often, you need a smaller doorway. Consistency matters more than intensity, because intensity depends heavily on emotion. Consistency depends on structure. Structure can survive moods. It can survive average days. It can survive fatigue, travel, stress, and imperfection. That is why habits become unbreakable, not when they are hard, but when they are repeatable. The disciplined life is not built by proving how much you can force yourself to endure on a rare heroic day. It is built by protecting a few worthwhile actions until they become part of the architecture of ordinary life. When that happens, discipline stops feeling like constant self-conflict and starts feeling like rhythm. You no longer need to become a new person every morning. You simply continue becoming the same person in the direction you have chosen. Perfection also makes discipline fragile. If a habit survives only when the schedule is clean, the mood is good, and life is orderly, then it has not been built for real life. Real life is uneven. It contains anxious mornings, sick days, travel, disappointment, and fatigue. A useful ritual must survive inside that reality. It may become smaller, but it must remain possible. That is why a single line written on a bad day can matter more than 3 perfect hours on a rare good day. A short walk during a difficult week may be more valuable than an ideal plan that collapses at the first disruption. So the real question is not, What is the hardest version I can force today? The real question is, what version can I still respect tomorrow? That question moves discipline away from ego and toward durability. And durability is what turns a habit into a way of being. The Viking lesson is not merely that preparation matters. It is that preparation creates a certain kind of calm. A sharpened blade changes not only what happens in battle, but how the warrior carries himself before battle. Readiness reduces panic. Maintenance reduces chaos. When you know you have honored the ritual, you stand differently in the face of uncertainty. Habits do this in modern life. They do not remove difficulty. They reduce unnecessary instability. A morning routine does not guarantee a perfect day, but it creates an anchoring point before the world begins demanding your attention. A reading ritual does not instantly make you wise, but it teaches the mind to stay with something longer than a swipe. A walking habit does not solve every emotional storm, but it gives the body a familiar path back into motion. A planning ritual does not eliminate unpredictability, but it keeps the day from dissolving entirely into reaction. This is why habits are not small in consequence, even when they are small in size. They create islands of order in an environment designed to fracture attention. Modern life is full of forces that dull the edge. Endless novelty, constant notifications, infinite comparison, frictionless distraction. The mind is pulled outward all day long, and without ritual, it becomes difficult to distinguish what you chose from what captured you. The Vikings lived with storms, cold, hunger, distance, and risk. We live with noise, fragmentation, speed, stimulation, and cognitive overload. The conditions differ, but the principle remains the same. If you do not deliberately maintain your tools degrade. And your attention is one of your most important tools. So is your word to yourself. Every time you keep a small promise, you strengthen that word. Every time you break a small promise casually, you weaken it. This is why habit is not only behavioral, it is moral in a quiet way. It concerns the relationship between your intention and your action. Can you trust yourself in small matters? Can you return when no one is watching? Can you practice order without applause? Can you maintain structure even when the mood is unimpressive and the result is delayed? That is where character is formed, not in grand declarations. In repeated private alignment, many people want self-mastery while despising repetition. But self-mastery is impossible without repetition. The self is trained through what it repeatedly does. If you repeatedly surrender attention, you train distraction. If you repeatedly postpone effort, you train avoidance. If you repeatedly return to the chosen act, you train steadiness. Habits are always shaping character in one direction or another. The question is not whether you are being formed. The question is by what. And this is why the sharpening ritual matters so much as a metaphor. It reminds us that maintenance is not secondary work. It is foundational work. The quiet act you repeat each day may never look impressive in isolation. But over months and years, it determines the kind of mind you bring into challenge, love, work, conflict, solitude, ambition, and loss. It determines whether you meet life dull or ready. Readiness is not flashy, but it changes your relationship to challenge. When your day already contains a few stable rituals, uncertainty no longer invades every corner of the mind. Some part of you remains ordered. Some part of you remembers the path. Habits reduce internal scattering and make attention easier to gather again. They also preserve dignity. There is dignity in making the bed after a difficult night. There is dignity in opening the book after a distracted day. There is dignity in taking the walk when no one would blame you for skipping it. These are acts of inner maintenance. They keep the self from becoming entirely reactive. They remind you that even inside an unstable world, some movements can still be chosen. This is why small habits help anxiety as much as ambition. They restore agency. They do not control the whole future, but they return one deliberate act to the present. The sharpening ritual therefore belongs not only to warriors, but to anyone rebuilding trust through small, repeatable acts. That is how a life changes without announcing itself. One stable ritual at a time. Tomorrow, you will almost certainly be offered a small choice that does not look important. That is how discipline usually appears. Not as a life-defining crossroads with music behind it, but as an ordinary moment that seems easy to dismiss. Open the notebook or keep scrolling. Put on the shoes or remain where you are. Read the page or delay again. Prepare the morning or trust your future self to rescue you. Go to bed when you said you would, or negotiate with yourself for another hour. These moments feel minor because they are common. But what is repeated most often becomes what shapes you most deeply. This is why the closing lesson is simple. Respect the small act. Do not ask whether it looks impressive. Ask whether it sharpens. Does it make the next right action easier? Does it strengthen self-trust? Does it reduce the distance between intention and behavior? Does it keep the ritual alive? If the answer is yes, then it matters more than the dramatic fantasy you keep postponing life for. Great strength is rarely created in dramatic moments. Dramatic moments reveal strength. They do not usually build it. Strength is built before the test, day after day, habit after habit, like steel against stone. At first, the process feels almost too quiet to deserve faith, but that quietness is not a weakness. It is a sign that you are working below the level of spectacle, in the place where identity is actually formed. This is where a distracted person becomes someone capable of focus. This is where a hesitant person becomes someone who begins. This is where a fragile promise becomes a trustworthy pattern. Not by one act of emotional intensity, but by repeated contact with chosen effort. The person who respects these daily rituals eventually notices a change that is difficult to explain to others. Life still contains difficulty. Resistance still appears. Fatigue still comes. But there is less inner chaos around action, less bargaining, less drama. The ritual carries part of the weight. You no longer have to manufacture a new self each morning. You inherit the self you have been practicing. That is a profound kind of freedom. So when the mind says, "Start bigger tomorrow," answer with something smaller today. When it says, "Wait until you feel ready," begin before readiness arrives. When it says, "This tiny action cannot matter," remember the blade. Remember the warrior before dawn. Remember the stone. Remember the nearly invisible stroke repeated with patience. And remember this: unbreakable discipline is not the power to force yourself endlessly. It is the wisdom to protect a few worthy rituals, long enough that they begin protecting you in return. They steady the mind. They simplify the next step. They keep you from drifting too far from the person you are trying to become. That is how an edge is formed. That is how it is maintained. And that is how, over time, a quiet life becomes a strong one. You do not need to feel impressive to begin. You do not need certainty. You do not need freedom from distraction, fear, or inconsistency. You need only enough honesty to choose one act that points in the right direction and enough humility to repeat it before the result becomes exciting. Not perfection, not intensity. Return. If you protect that return long enough, the ritual starts doing work on your behalf. It shortens the distance between thought and action and builds a person who can be relied upon by themselves. That may be the deepest form of discipline, not domination over the self, but reliability within the self. So let the world worship sudden transformation. You can choose something steadier: the page, the walk, the breath, the preparation, the small return. The act repeated before anyone would call it meaningful. One day the effect of that choice will be obvious. Long before it is obvious, it will already be real. That is how strong lives are built.